There is a strange and growing uneasiness within humanity today. It lies just beneath the surface of our daily routines, our ambitions, and our distractions. It's not something we always articulate, but it's something we feel. A sense that something vital is slipping away, that the world is spiraling into deeper fragmentation, and that despite all our progress, all our knowledge, something is fundamentally missing, and perhaps that something is awareness, deep living awareness of what we are doing, and where we are going. That is why there is an urgency, a profound urgency to awaken. This awakening is not to some ideology, some belief, or a new movement. It is not a political awakening or a social revolution. It is an inner revolution, a total shift in how we see ourselves and the world around us, because we have lived too long in a state of fragmentation. We are divided within ourselves, torn between our desires and fears, between our public masks and our private confusion. We are also divided from each other by religion, by nationality, by class, race, opinion, and ideology. And this fragmentation, this inner and outer division, is tearing the world apart. It has given rise to wars, to environmental collapse, to the deep loneliness and meaninglessness so many people silently endure. We must see this not merely as a set of global problems out there, but as something that begins in us. The world is what we are. Society is the extension of our own consciousness. If there is greed, hatred, violence, and confusion in society, it is because these same things exist in our own hearts and minds. That is not a moral judgment. It is not about blame. It is a fact. And until we see this fact clearly and honestly, we will continue to look for solutions outside of ourselves, more laws, more systems, more leaders to follow. But none of these things can resolve the fundamental crisis we face, because the root of the crisis is in consciousness itself. The transformation of the world, therefore, begins with the transformation of the individual, not in isolation, not in some selfish pursuit of enlightenment, but through deep attention, through self-understanding, and through waking up to the actual state of our minds. To awaken means to look, really look at how we live. It means to question the assumptions we have inherited, the beliefs we hold, the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. Most of us live in a state of mental sleepwalking. We go through the motions of life, work, family, entertainment, without ever deeply inquiring into what this life is actually about. We are caught in patterns, conditioned by culture and upbringing, shaped by fear and desire. We chase after security, pleasure, success, thinking these things will give us peace, and when they fail, we feel lost, angry, depressed, but rarely do we ask, is there another way to live, a different way of seeing? This questioning is not a luxury. It is not something reserved for philosophers or monks. It is essential for each one of us, because without this inquiry, we become mechanical. We may be clever, capable, and even successful by society's standards, but inwardly we are empty. We are anxious, insecure, restless. We are always seeking something, more experiences, more distractions, more validation. And in that constant search, we miss the most important thing, the direct perception of what is. To perceive what is means to observe without distortion. It means to see without the filters of judgment, comparison, or expectation. It means to look at ourselves, not with guilt or pride, but with clear, quiet attention. And this kind of observation is the beginning of intelligence, not the intelligence of books and knowledge, but a deeper, holistic intelligence that arises when the mind is quiet and alert. In that state, there is no conflict. There is no division between the observer and the observed. The mind is no longer trying to become something. It is not seeking an ideal or escaping from fear. It is simply aware of its own movements, of its own thoughts, of its own feelings. And in that awareness, there is transformation, not effort, not control, but transformation through understanding. This transformation is the essence of awakening. It is not about adding more to ourselves. It is not about becoming better versions of who we already are. It is about seeing through the illusions we have built, seeing how we cling to identities, to narratives, to images, and letting them go. Because in letting go of the false, the real can emerge. But this awakening is not something that happens once and is done. It is a living process. It requires continuous attention, not in a tense or forced way, but in a way that is alive and curious. The world we live in is full of noise, full of distraction. Every device, every advertisement, every system around us is designed to pull us away from ourselves, and so we must reclaim our attention. We must learn to be present, not just during meditation or quiet moments, but in the middle of life itself, when we are walking, when we are talking, when we are working. Can we be fully there, listening, watching, not drifting away into habit and thought? That is the challenge, and it is not easy. But it is the most important thing we can do, because the future of humanity depends not on technology, not on governments, not on economic growth. It depends on whether human beings can awaken to the totality of life, to the interconnection of all things, and to the possibility of living without fear, without division, without conflict. This urgency is not born out of panic. It is not a call to act in haste. It is a quiet but firm realization that time is not unlimited. We are not guaranteed another day, another year, and the world cannot wait for another generation to figure it out. The violence, the destruction, the ecological collapse, all of it is accelerating. And yet, in the face of this crisis, there is also a great opportunity, the opportunity to step out of the old patterns, the inherited madness, and to live in a way that is sane, compassionate, and deeply awake. No one can do this for us. No teacher, no system, no belief can make us awake. It is something we must see for ourselves. But once we see, we are no longer bound. We are no longer victims of our conditioning. We become human in the deepest sense of the word, not just functioning creatures, but beings capable of love, of clarity, of true relationship. And so we begin, not tomorrow, not when the conditions are perfect, but now in this moment, in this breath, in this very act of listening and looking. Because the moment we truly begin to observe without escape, something shifts, the light of awareness is kindled, and in that light the false begins to fall away. In a world that is constantly changing, where uncertainty seems to grow by the day, we find ourselves looking for something to hold on to, some idea, some belief, some structure that promises safety. That promise becomes a kind of comfort, a cushion against the vast unknown. And yet, if we are deeply honest with ourselves, we might begin to see that much of what we cling to for security is not actually secure at all. It is a false assurance, a kind of illusion we maintain, not because it is true, but because it helps us feel less afraid. This search for assurance is understandable. We grow up in systems that condition us to seek guarantees of happiness, of success, of safety, of love. From a young age, we are taught to pursue certain goals, to believe certain things, to fit into certain roles. And with each step, we are offered assurances. If you study hard, you will succeed. If you follow the rules, you will be respected. If you believe in this doctrine, you will be saved. If you love someone enough, you will never be lonely. These assurances form the psychological backbone of our lives, but as we move through life, cracks begin to show. We start to realize that things don't always go according to plan. People change, systems fail, beliefs are challenged, and nothing, absolutely nothing, seems permanent. But instead of facing this instability directly, we often retreat even more deeply into illusion. We look for new assurances or double down on the old ones. We tell ourselves stories to cover the discomfort. We seek answers from others, leaders, experts, ideologies, hoping they will do the work of certainty for us, and when they disappoint us, we move on to the next promise. The cycle repeats. And what we don't see is that this endless search for psychological security may be the very thing that keeps us trapped. The human mind wants to be certain. It wants to know. It wants to believe that if it just follows a particular path, it will be rewarded. But life doesn't operate according to our desires. Life is complex, fluid, full of mystery, and our need for false assurance is often in direct conflict with the nature of life itself. When we cling to fixed ideas about ourselves, about others, about the world, we stop being able to see clearly. We interpret everything through the lens of our need for control, and so we distort reality in subtle and not so subtle ways, because the truth often threatens the fragile constructions we've built. Take, for example, the idea of identity. We tell ourselves, I am this kind of person, I have this background, this personality, these values. It gives us a sense of coherence, but in truth, we are constantly changing. Our thoughts, our emotions, our reactions, they shift from moment to moment. And yet, we hold tightly to an image of who we are because that image gives us a sense of stability. The same happens in relationships. We say, this person will always be there for me, this love is forever, and maybe it feels that way for a time. But things change, people change, circumstances change, and when reality doesn't match our expectation, we suffer not necessarily because of what has happened, but because of the false assurance we had invested in. Religion, too, has often served as a major source of assurance. For many, it provides answers to life's biggest questions: why we are here, what happens after we die, what is right and wrong. These answers can offer comfort, community, and purpose. But they can also become rigid when belief replaces inquiry, when dogma replaces observation. We stop listening, we stop questioning, and in doing so, we may miss the actual sacredness of life as it unfolds. We settle for borrowed truth instead of discovering truth for ourselves. Modern life also offers its own version of assurance in the form of technology, data, consumerism, and productivity. We are told that if we just have the right tools, the right information, the right lifestyle, we will finally feel okay. We download self-help apps, track our sleep, follow trends, consume endless content promising transformation. And still, the underlying unease remains, because the sense of incompleteness isn't something we can fix with an app or a lifestyle. It comes from a deeper place, a place we often refuse to look at. That deeper place is the unknown. And our fear of the unknown is what drives us to construct all these assurances in the first place. But what if, instead of trying to escape the unknown, we turn toward it? What if we stopped running from the uncertainty of life and instead allowed ourselves to stand in the middle of it, vulnerable and awake? It sounds frightening, and at first it is. But in that space, something extraordinary becomes possible. We begin to see not through the filters of what we want to believe, but through the clarity of direct perception. To live without false assurance is not the same as living in fear or despair. On the contrary, it is the beginning of real freedom. Because when we no longer rely on illusions to feel secure, we become capable of meeting life as it actually is. We become sensitive to the present moment, not what we wish it were, but what it is. In that presence, we start to understand ourselves more deeply. We notice the subtle ways we avoid discomfort, the small lies we tell ourselves, the roles we play to feel safe. And in seeing all of this without judgment, we begin to let go, not out of discipline or effort, but because we no longer need those props. Letting go of false assurance does not mean rejecting everything or falling into nihilism. It means seeing clearly what is real and what is not. It means recognizing that beliefs, roles, identities, systems all have their place, but they are not the ground of being. They are not the source of our freedom or our love. Real strength comes from being able to stand without them, or to use them without being used by them. This is not something that can be taught through a formula or attained through a technique. It is something that unfolds naturally when we begin to observe, when we stop running, stop pretending, and begin to look at life directly. It requires honesty, it requires courage, but it also brings with it a kind of beauty, because in the absence of false assurance, we begin to encounter something far more alive, the raw, unfiltered reality of existence, which is not ours to control, but to meet with openness, humility, and attention. Faith is a word we hear often, but rarely do we stop to ask what it truly means. For many, it's tied to religion, to traditions, to sacred texts and rituals. For others, it might mean trust in a person, a future, a cause. But when we strip away all the layers of doctrine and dogma, what is faith really? It is not belief. It is not blind acceptance. True faith is something living, something active. It is a movement of the heart and mind that is deeply rooted in clarity, not confusion. And when faith is real, when it is born not out of fear but out of direct inner experience, it naturally bears fruit. It manifests in how we live, how we relate, and how we respond to the challenges of life. But we must be careful, because what is commonly called faith is often just a disguised form of dependency. It becomes a psychological crutch, something we hold on to because we are afraid to face uncertainty. We believe in a higher power, or a path, or a philosophy, not because we have truly seen, but because we have been told, and it comforts us. There is nothing wrong with comfort, but comfort is not truth. And if our faith is built only on the words of others, or on the repetition of practices, it remains shallow. It does not transform us. It does not awaken love or compassion or insight. It becomes static, like a painting of a tree that can never bear real fruit. True faith, on the other hand, is dynamic. It is alive. It grows as we grow, deepens as we deepen. It begins with a seed, a glimpse, a moment of insight, a flash of something real that we cannot quite explain but cannot ignore. Perhaps it comes in a moment of silence, when all thoughts fall away and something vast and still begins to move within. Or perhaps it comes in a moment of pain, when all our strategies collapse and we are left vulnerable and open. In these moments, we touch something beyond the ordinary, not something supernatural, but something profoundly human, real presence, real awareness, something intimate and beyond words. That glimpse plants a seed. And from there, faith becomes a way of living, not a belief in something out there, but a trust in the unfolding of life itself. A trust that we can meet each moment fully without needing to escape into illusions. This kind of faith is not passive. It asks everything of us. It demands that we look honestly, that we listen deeply, that we stay present even when things are difficult. It is not faith that something specific will happen, but faith that we can meet whatever happens with awareness, with courage, with integrity. And this is where fruit begins to appear, not as rewards or miracles, but as subtle, natural changes in how we live. A person with true faith is not necessarily loud or confident or outwardly spiritual. They may be quiet, simple, unassuming, but in their presence there is a kind of steadiness. They are not thrown around by every opinion or every mood. They are not obsessed with outcomes. They listen more than they speak. They love without needing to possess. They act with care, not because they are trying to prove something, but because that care flows naturally from their being. They don't need to tell you they have faith. You feel it. This fruit of faith is not dramatic. It often goes unnoticed. It is found in small moments, in the way someone forgives without resentment, or how they sit with a friend in pain without trying to fix anything. It shows up in the ability to remain calm when others panic, to choose honesty over comfort, to keep walking even when the path is unclear. These are not flashy traits, but they are powerful. They shape the world in quiet, enduring ways. And they do not come from effort alone. They come from inner clarity, from a heart that is anchored in something deeper than circumstance. True faith is also intimately connected with humility, not the kind of humility that puts oneself down, but the kind that recognizes our limits without shame. The kind that knows we don't have all the answers and that we don't need to. It's the humility that bows not to a figure or a book, but to the mystery of life itself. When we live with that kind of humility, we are open. We are teachable. We don't cling to being right. We listen not just to others, but to the quiet guidance of our own deeper nature. And perhaps one of the most beautiful things about true faith is that it doesn't separate. It doesn't say, my path is the only path, or my truth is the only truth. It recognizes that the sacred cannot be captured in one form, one tradition, one idea. It honors diversity without falling into confusion. It sees the common thread in the many different expressions of wisdom and love that human beings have cultivated throughout history, because when faith is real, it doesn't need to argue or convert. It simply shines, and in that light others are invited, not pushed, to look deeper into their own lives. In a world full of noise, full of promises and claims and arguments, true faith is like a still flame. It doesn't demand attention, but it illuminates the space around it, and in its presence we begin to remember something essential, something the world often makes us forget, that we are not here to merely survive or accumulate or prove ourselves. We are here to live with depth, with meaning, with heart, and that kind of life cannot be lived through ideology or imitation. It must be lived from the inside out. We often try to force fruit before the tree has taken root. We want results, we want peace, purpose, connection, but we don't want to sit in silence, to wait, to dig deep. True faith invites us to do that inner work, to trust the unseen, to water the soil of our being, to tend to the roots with patience. And in time, without striving, the fruit appears, not because we chased it, but because we lived in alignment with what is true. This alignment doesn't mean perfection. It doesn't mean we never struggle or doubt. In fact, doubt is often part of the process, but when doubt is met with inquiry, with presence, with honesty, it strengthens faith rather than weakening it, because faith that cannot endure doubt is not faith at all. It's just an idea held together by fear. Real faith grows stronger when it is tested, not because it becomes rigid, but because it becomes more real, more grounded, more compassionate. There is something inside each of us that already knows what is real. We may have forgotten it, buried it, ignored it, but it's there. And true faith is the process of uncovering that knowing, not imposing anything from the outside, but clearing away what is false so that what is true can shine. It is not about finding something new, it is about coming home to what was always here, and when we live from that place, our actions, our words, our presence, they begin to nourish others. That is the fruit of faith. Not belief, not belonging, but the quiet, living evidence of a heart that has learned to trust what it cannot see and love what it cannot always understand. When we speak of the holiness of God, we often reach instinctively for words that suggest something distant, elevated, untouchable. We associate holiness with awe, reverence, and separation from all that is ordinary. And while there is truth in that, there is also something deeper that we sometimes overlook. The holiness of God is not merely about grandeur or perfection. It is about presence. It is about an essence so pure, so utterly free from corruption, that the human mind can barely begin to grasp it. Yet strangely, though it feels beyond us, it also calls to us, not as something far away, but as something intimately near, if only we have the eyes to see and the heart to receive. Holiness is not simply about moral purity or adherence to rules. It is not confined to temples or rituals or sacred texts, though those things may point toward it. The holiness of God is not a thing we can define, explain, or control. It is the uncontainable reality of who God is, utterly beyond and yet deeply involved. It is the beauty that stuns us into silence, the justice that burns through all our excuses, the mercy that meets us when we least deserve it. Holiness is not something God possesses like a trait. It is what God is. To encounter the holiness of God is to come face to face with that which is absolutely other, and yet somehow more familiar than our own breath. And that is why, throughout time, those who have truly encountered the holiness of God have not walked away proud or puffed up. They have fallen to their knees, undone by the weight of reality. The prophet Isaiah cried out, "Woe is me, for I am ruined." Not because God condemned him, but because in that moment he saw himself clearly in the light of absolute truth. Holiness reveals, it strips away illusion, it lays us bare, not to shame us, but to awaken us. And in that awakening, something in us is changed, not by force, but by the sheer gravity of divine presence. But here is the paradox. The holiness of God, while awe-inspiring, is not distant. It is not cold or aloof. In fact, it is precisely the holiness of God that draws near to us in love. It is holiness that cannot bear to see injustice continue. It is holiness that refuses to abandon the broken. It is holiness that weeps for the suffering and lifts up the humble. We tend to think of holiness as separation from sin, and it is. But it is also complete commitment to healing, to restoration, to redemption. God's holiness does not recoil from our mess. It moves toward it with blazing compassion. This is not a gentle or passive thing. Holiness is fierce. It is a consuming fire, not in the sense of destruction, but in the sense of purification. It burns away what is false, what is selfish, what is dead. And if we are honest, that can be terrifying, because we have all grown comfortable with things in ourselves that do not reflect the heart of God. We justify, we defend, we hide, but holiness does not play along with our masks. It invites us to something deeper, to surrender, to transformation, to truth. And this truth is not a harsh command, but a loving call. It is the call to return to what we were created for, to live in the presence of the holy, to reflect that holiness in how we live, to walk in a way that is aligned with the sacredness of all things. Because the holiness of God is not just a theological ideal, it is an invitation to see the world as sacred, to treat people as sacred, to live our lives not in fear, but in reverence, not reverence as stiffness or ritual, but as wonder, gratitude, and care. When we begin to recognize the holiness of God, everything changes. We can no longer look at our neighbors with contempt or indifference. We can no longer treat the earth as a commodity. We can no longer use our words or our actions to harm, to divide, to dominate. Not because we are following rules, but because our hearts have been captured by something greater, because we have glimpsed the holy, and it has changed what we desire. It has changed how we see. That kind of change does not happen through pressure or performance. It happens through encounter, through stillness, through letting go of our ego's need to control or define God. The holy is not something we can possess or use. It is not ours to manage. It simply is. And the more we quiet ourselves, the more we listen, the more we begin to perceive its whisper, sometimes in beauty, sometimes in pain, sometimes in moments so ordinary we might miss them if we're not paying attention. Holiness has a way of slipping past our defenses. It shows up in the tears we didn't expect, in the silence that feels full, in the sudden awareness that we are not alone. And when it comes, we don't need to explain it. We don't even need to understand it. We just need to receive it, to let it do what it does, to open us, to humble us, to heal us. There is a kind of reverence that comes, not from fear of punishment, but from the sheer magnitude of love. That is the reverence holiness calls forth, not trembling before a tyrant, but bowing before a beauty so vast it leaves us speechless. It is the kind of awe that says, I don't want to run from this, I want to live in it, I want to carry it in how I speak, in how I touch the world. Because if God is holy, and God is, then everything God touches is holy too, and that includes us, but we must be willing to be touched, we must be willing to be disrupted, to be undone, to be remade, because holiness is not here to flatter our egos. It is here to liberate our souls, and liberation is not always comfortable. It may mean letting go of things we once thought were essential. It may mean standing against systems we once benefited from. It may mean listening when we would rather speak, forgiving when we would rather retaliate, trusting when we would rather control. This is what it means to walk in the light of God's holiness, not to pretend we are perfect, but to live in awareness of the one who is. To let that awareness shape us, soften us, call us higher, to live not for appearances, but for truth, not for approval, but for love, because holiness is not sterile, it is not cold, it is not separate from life. It is life in its purest form, and it is always calling us, not to escape the world, but to enter it more deeply, more honestly, more fully awake to the sacred that pulses through it all. There is a quiet voice that speaks beneath all the noise in our lives. It doesn't shout or demand attention, but it's there, steady and persistent. It invites us to pause, to look, to listen, and what it says is simple, but not easy. Examine yourself. It's a call that isn't meant to shame or condemn, but to awaken. Because most of the time, we live on the surface. We react, we perform, we move from one thing to the next without truly seeing what's happening inside of us. But the invitation to examine ourselves isn't just a suggestion. It's a vital part of being alive, of being honest, of being human. Self-examination isn't about obsessing over our flaws or getting lost in guilt. It's about clarity. It's about truth. It's the willingness to stop and ask, what's really going on in me? Why am I doing what I'm doing? What are the motivations behind my choices, my habits, my relationships, my beliefs? These questions can be uncomfortable. They disrupt our routines, they challenge the stories we've told ourselves, but they're necessary because without examination, we stay stuck. We keep repeating the same patterns, we blame others, we project, we pretend. There's a certain courage required to examine ourselves, especially when the world around us is so busy and full of distractions. We're constantly being told to keep going, to achieve more, to appear a certain way. And in that race, it's easy to avoid the deeper questions. It's easier to stay distracted than to sit quietly with what we really feel. But silence has a way of bringing things to the surface. And if we can face what's there without judgment, if we can simply look with honesty and compassion, something begins to shift. Sometimes we're afraid to look inside because we think we'll find only darkness. But that's not the full picture. Yes, we might see pride, fear, resentment, or selfishness. But we'll also find longing, tenderness, the desire to grow, the spark of love that hasn't gone out. Self-examination is not about seeing only what's wrong. It's about seeing everything. It's about bringing light into places we've hidden from ourselves, not to punish, but to understand, because understanding opens the door to change, and real change doesn't come from willpower alone. It comes from seeing clearly. There are moments in life, maybe after a crisis, a loss, a failure, when everything we thought we knew gets shaken, and in those moments we have a choice. We can numb ourselves and go back to sleep, or we can take the opportunity to look deeper, to ask what really matters, to consider whether we've been living from truth or just from habit. These moments of disruption, though painful, are sacred. They can break our hearts open in a way that leads us back to what's real, but we don't have to wait for crisis to begin this work. We can choose it daily, quietly, humbly, gently. To examine ourselves is not to turn inward in selfishness. It is to turn inward in sincerity, and from that sincerity comes wisdom. When we are honest about our weaknesses, we become more patient with others. When we see our own tendency to judge, we become more compassionate. When we name our wounds, we stop taking them out on the world. The more we know ourselves, the more we can live from a place of integrity, not just doing what looks good, but doing what aligns with our values, even when no one is watching. There's a temptation to compare our lives to others, to measure our worth by their success or image, but self-examination isn't about comparison. It's about authenticity. No one else can do this work for us. No one else knows the full story of our heart. We are the only ones who can truly sit with ourselves and ask the hard questions. And when we do, we might find places where we've been pretending, places where we've been living from fear rather than faith. We might discover that some of our beliefs aren't actually ours. They were inherited, absorbed, never questioned, and it's okay to realize that. It's good to let go of what no longer serves us, to clear space for what is true. This is not a one-time process. It's a way of life. It's something we return to again and again, like coming home, and the more we practice it, the more natural it becomes. We start noticing our reactions. We catch ourselves before we lash out. We pause before making decisions. We begin to ask, what's really driving me here? Is it love? Is it fear? Is it truth? And we learn to be honest, not just with ourselves, but with others. We begin to speak more openly. We stop hiding behind masks, and in that honesty there is freedom. There is also responsibility, because once we see clearly, we can't unsee. Once we know, we can't go back to pretending. And that knowing calls us to act, to grow, to forgive, to ask forgiveness, to make things right where we can. This is where real transformation happens, not just in what we say we believe, but in how we live, in the small moments, in the choices no one sees. That's where integrity is built. That's where peace begins. But we must also be gentle. Self-examination isn't a weapon to use against ourselves. It's a mirror, not a hammer. And like any mirror, it's meant to reflect, not to distort. It shows us what's there so we can respond with grace, not self-hate. The goal is not perfection. It's presence, awareness, humility. And from that humility grows real strength. Not the strength to dominate, but the strength to be honest, to be kind, to stay awake. In a world that often encourages us to look outward, to build image, to accumulate, This inner work is radical, it's quiet, but it's revolutionary because it changes how we relate to everything, to ourselves, to others, to life. It makes us less reactive, more rooted. It gives us eyes to see not just what we want, but what truly matters. And in that clarity, we find purpose, not something grand or flashy, but something steady and real. Each of us is a mystery in motion. We are complex, layered, evolving, and the call to examine ourselves is not about reducing who we are to labels or categories. It's about honoring that complexity. It's about becoming curious. Noticing where we are open and where we are closed, where we are loving and where we are guarded, and instead of judging those places, we approach them with compassion. We hold them in the light, and slowly, over time, that light begins to do its work. There is a sacredness in this process, a dignity, and when we engage in it sincerely, we find that we are not alone. Others are walking this path too. Others are wrestling, awakening, learning, and that gives us courage. Because we don't have to have it all figured out. We just have to keep showing up, keep paying attention, keep being honest, and trust that this work matters, not just for ourselves, but for the kind of world we're helping to create, one moment at a time.